There's a box just by the door on your way out for anybody who wants to leave a donation. As you know, all of you are members of the Historical Society. There is no membership charge or fee as such, and basically it's the donation box that keeps us going and covers our printing costs, etc. And now, without further ado, I'd like to just say that light travels faster than sound, which is why some people appear bright until they speak. Now, you're not going to have any problem tonight. You're going to have a big problem tonight, folks, because you better put your sunglasses on for Sean Bagnall, and he's got here tonight, and he's going to regale us about Rebecca Clarke from Bandon. Sean.
Thanks, I just want to put a little bit of background to you. First of all, we're going to be talking about West Cork. And in particular, we're going to be talking about what's now the N71 road from Cork out to Inishannon there, to Bandon, down to Clonakilty, and on as far as Rosscarbery. This is the area we're going to be talking about. And we're also going to be talking about the Foundling Hospital in Cork. And the Foundling Hospital in Cork, I think it's now Murphy's Brewery. It's covered anyhow with brewery tax. But it was located here, just between Leitrim Street, which is the main road off to Limerick now, and Watercourse Road. Just at this area, just up from Pope's Quay. The Foundling Hospital was there. Now, on the 2nd of October, 1834, Rebecca Clarke startled the Assistant Commissioners, Mr. Thomas Martin Esquire and Mr. John Lawler Esquire, who were that day taking evidence at the sitting of the Poor Inquiry in the parishes of Kilbrogan and Ballymoodin in the barony of Killameckie, Bandon, County Cork. Those two parishes then, as they do now, made up the town of Bandon. Rebecca's unorthodox method of assisting in the disposing of deserted children, it's a topic that's quite topical even this week, of the deserted children of Bandon, was described so honestly and with such candour and openness that the Assistant Commissioner saw fit to record her description in full. Apart from her own story of her own activities, she also set out a detailed description of ingenious and corrupt abuses of the system by others. For Rebecca told of the abuse of the system for dealing with deserted babies by the officials in Bandon. She told of the efforts by deserting mothers to get their babies well set up after the process of abandonment. And she told of efforts by married couples to corrupt the system for dealing with deserted babies into a form of child allowance. But she did not tell the whole story at Bandon. For other parishes in West Cork disclosed entirely separately that they also availed of her unique assistance in disposing of their deserted babies, so that Rebecca was at the centre of a small enterprise facilitating her local clients in their corruption of the available foundling service. And before recounting the evidence of Rebecca, it is well to set out some description of the Poor Inquiry, its purpose and its findings in relation to deserted and orphan children generally. Some history of the development of the foundling system will be summarised, and it is also possible to look at some of the local and political attitudes which were guiding and designing the development of welfare institutions at this early stage of the poor law regime, and it will also be worthwhile to look at hints and indications that at least some of the practices in Bandon may not have been so isolated. Foundling or deserted children were already a serious problem in the 17th and 18th century, and we can be sure, I think, that the problem goes back to the dawn of history itself. Many who gave evidence to the Poor Inquiry in 1834 said that such children were nearly always illegitimate, and it probably was so. The Poor Relief Act of 1601 was the first attempt to deal with poverty in England, and it established a parish-based system for dealing with poverty in its many manifestations. The Act did not apply to Ireland, and similar problems were becoming acute on this island. Discussions were taking place, and in 1688, Dublin Corporation passed a resolution stating an intention to build a workhouse for Dublin's poor. But it was 1703 before the Irish Parliament passed an enactment for the providing of the erection of a workhouse where the poor might be compelled to work for their subsistence. In due course, a workhouse was erected at the southwest of James's Street on a parcel of land containing 14 acres and referred to it as that time as the Pipes. This is now the site of St. James's Hospital. But homeless children under 5 years were still the responsibility of the parish. Then in 1730, in response to the growing numbers of abandoned children and infants, an act was passed obliging the governors of this workhouse to accept those abandoned infants from the parish churchwardens. And so, after 1730, a part of the workhouse was set aside as a foundling hospital, and the workhouse at James's Street became the foundling hospital and workhouse of the city of Dublin. This establishment accepted babies brought by the churchwardens in the normal way, but there was also a basket fixed to a revolving door where people could abandon babies anonymously and ring a bell as they departed to draw attention to the baby. Churchwardens at various city parishes also employed lifters, those who on a nightly basis collected abandoned babies found on the streets. These babies were either removed to the foundling hospital or given a drink from a bottle of narcotic which stopped any crying but put many of the babies to sleep permanently. The workhouse at James's Street to continue to provide a foundling hospital for Dublin's abandoned babies until 1832 when it was closed down. Then in 1735 another act was passed providing for the setting up of a similar institution in Cork City. This workhouse was constructed, as I pointed out to you, on the Watercourse Road in Cork City, and the Act provided that the institution was to be supported by a levy of 1 shilling on every tonne of coal and anthracite imported into Cork. This workhouse opened in 1747, and it differed from Dublin in that so great was what we might call the misbegotten fecundity of the people of Cork. I hope there's no Cork here, is there? That it was used entirely as a foundling hospital from the very beginning. No part of it was ever used as a workhouse. This was the institution to which in 1834 Rebecca Clarke brought her charges. And a workhouse was eventually provided in Bandon in November of 1841. The accounts for the Cork Foundling Hospital in the early 1830s, in 1832 in particular, indicate that it had an income of £6,002, 16 shillings and 8pence, here you go here, from the tax on coal, and that would indicate imports of about 120,000 tonnes of coal in that year. And you can see that in the same year, it had expenses of £2,047 and 14 shillings on nursing expenses, indicating that it was probably looking after about 680 babies being nursed at £3 a year each. So that will give you an idea of the scale of the money and the problem that the Cork Foundling Hospital was dealing with. The Poor Inquiry itself was conducted in 1834 to inquire into the condition of the poorer classes, as the official title said, of Your Majesty's subjects in Ireland. And this massive report, it runs to over 5,500 pages, was published in 1835. In describing the extent of their task, the commissioners commented that the poorer classes in Ireland may be considered as comprehending nearly the whole population. During 1834, assistant commissioners sat at numerous venues around Ireland taking evidence about the state of poverty in Ireland under a number of headings. And the headings were, and this will give you an insight into the way people thought, deserted and orphaned children, illegitimate children and their mothers, widows having families of young children, the impotent through age or other permanent infirmity, the sick poor who in health are capable of earning their subsistence, the able-bodied out of work, and vagrancy as a mode of relief. I'll just make 3 comments about that now before I go on. Archbishop Wakely of Dublin designed it, and he was quite a genius because it was very well designed and very well conducted. But informing it the whole way through was the distinction that people in those days always drew between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. That's point 1. Point 2 is vagrancy as a mode of relief, beggars. Appendix A is the appendix, and the Appendix A alone is over 1,000 pages long, dealing with these 8 headings. Almost half of Appendix A, over 500 pages, is dealing with vagrancy as a mode of relief. It was by far the biggest problem in rural Ireland at the time. And the third point I just want to make is, and Anne knows this or doesn't realise it that she knows it, is that I hope I'm acceptable, but I've already been booked for here for a talk next year, and I'll be dealing with the first 3 headings. The deserted and orphaned children and women, basically. Now, in the Poor Inquiry, assistant commissioners sat in one parish in each barony in 17 named counties at public meetings and took evidence under these headings from those who attended. All sorts of people attended, from beggars and mendicants to clergymen, land stewards and members of the local aristocracy. Various measures were put in place to ensure as far as possible impartiality and fairness in collecting evidence. Care was taken to ensure that a cross-section of people of all classes and clergy of all denominations attended. And it was decided in collecting the evidence to have a native resident of Ireland together with a native of Great Britain sitting together as assistant commissioners gathering the evidence. All evidence had to be given in the joint presence of both assistant commissioners. And just in the context of Rebecca Clarke's story, one of the rules was that any statement made by an individual and not impugned, not attacked or contradicted by any other person present, would be considered to be acknowledged as at least probable by all. And the evidence at the parishes of Kilbrogan and Ballymoodin in Bandon appears to have survived this test. The general run of the reports in the Poor Inquiry indicated an approximate orthodoxy across the country in relation to deserted children. These children were variously described as orphans, foundlings, illegitimate or abandoned, and they were invariably deserted by their mothers. There were common features in all counties reported on, and an outline of these common features will highlight just how different the people Rebecca Clarke served were in their approach to these problems. Generally, it was reported that deserted children were always illegitimate. This sad fact was reported from all 17 counties in which the Poor Inquiry held public meetings. In relation to the abandonment of the babies, the evidence varied as to whether they survived being abandoned. Many of the inquiries were told that some of the abandoned babies perished before being found. Comments were made about the extent of infanticide, and there were conflicting opinions whether there was an increase in this crime after the closing of the Foundling Hospital in Dublin in 1832. Others commented that there was a decrease in the numbers of abandoned and deserted babies since the closure of the hospital. These comments were made in the Leinster area served by the Dublin Foundling Hospital. Some of the babies were abandoned in a way suggesting that those abandoning them took care to feed and clothe them properly, and to abandon them where they were likely to be found quickly and safely. In other cases, no such care was taken. There was debate at many of the inquiries as to whether the practice of looking after deserted babies actually increased the incidence of desertion. And in any event, this appears to have been preferable to the crime of infanticide in the eyes of many. So they were the moral issues at the time, and that was the way people thought about them. After being found, the babies first were previously the responsibility of the parish in which they were found. They had been previously the responsibility of the parish in which they were found. But in 1834, this responsibility had just been transferred to the grand jury. And this was part of the system exploited by Rebecca Clarke. Each parish had a church warden with responsibility for abandoned or deserted children. The parish applied to the grand jury at the periodic assizes for funding to provide, among other things, for the maintenance of deserted babies, and may have provided in some way for the nursing infant from the date of its discovery until the assizes time came around. Provision was made for these children generally in one of two ways. Firstly, they could be placed by the parish in the foundling hospital where a foundling hospital was available. There was a once-off charge on the parish of £5 payable to the hospital when such babies were handed over to it. The foundling hospital then either found foster families for the babies, or it set to bringing up those babies within the hospital itself. This seems to have been the least costly way to deal with the issue. Secondly, the parish could arrange for the babies to be put to foster with a suitable local family. An annual payment was made for this to the fostering family, and there was an upper limit to this payment of £5 a year. This amount was paid in a number of areas in Leinster, where it was also reported that £5 was paid while the baby was wet nursed, with payment reducing to £3.10 per annum. The annual payment in other areas appears to have been somewhat less, and appears to have been usually in the order of £3 to £3.10. It was reported in Connaught, for instance, that one family was paid 6 shillings per month, or £3.12 in a year. And in some instances, it was remarked that the parish was unable to maintain the agreed payments. And what seems to have happened, almost an unsaid conspiracy, was that if you found a foster family for a baby and paid them £3 or £4 or whatever to take it for the first year, and then stopped paying, at that stage they'd come to love the child and they weren't going to hand it back anyhow. And that seems to have been built into the system. In much of Munster, the annual payment was described as being from £3 to £5. This was an annual charge on the grand jury until the child reached about 11 years, or younger in many cases, when he or she was apprenticed. At this stage, the apprenticeship fund was an issue in some areas. There was an occasional indication in the reports of Catholic clergy making other arrangements for the upbringing of deserted babies, perhaps reflecting local concerns with official structures for dealing with the problem. Don't forget that when we're talking about the official structure here and the church wardens and the parish, the established church, the Church of Ireland, was administering all of that. And if people felt, sometimes they might acknowledge who gave birth to the child by wanting it brought up a Catholic, indicating perhaps that they knew it had Catholic parents. And these were all the politics of the situation. Now, the charge could be substantial, particularly the apprenticeship charge or the annual charge for maintaining them, and various efforts were made to recover some part of the cost from the fathers where they could be identified or located. For instance, it was reported at Selbridge, County Kildare, that actions against putative fathers were taken for the recovery of wages payable for the maintenance of such children, and this seems to have been the general form of legal action in such cases. In many cases, and I'll be talking about this next year because you have the whole business of breach of promise actions and all the rest of it. In many cases, it was reported that the foster child became so attached to the foster family and they to the child that such children became absorbed into the fostering family. And that's reported generally, and you'll realise a possible other significance to that when we get to the end of the story. It was mentioned in some cases that this happened when children were fostered to childless couples, but it appears to have happened in many other cases also. Many of the inquiries held that the foster children, when with suitable families, invariably turned out to be better than the children brought up in the family institutions. At one inquiry, it was mentioned that the boys and girls of such institutions frequently turned to crime, and the girls very often ended up in prostitution. Several of the institutions in Dublin placed the children for whom they were responsible with farming families outside of Dublin, and one institution stated its preference for dairy farmers because they were better able to feed the children. And in fact, there was one particular institution in Dublin recorded at the time that it had a particular relationship with Tallaght, Brina and Glenasmole, and that it fostered all of its children in that area. Most of these orthodox methods of dealing with deserted children were confirmed in a written submission made by the Archbishop of Tuam and set out in full. That was Archbishop MacHale, and that his report is set out in full. The evidence, we'll get back to Rebecca Clarke now. The evidence of Rebecca Clarke in the inquiry held at the parishes of Ballymoon and Kilbrogan, encompassing the town of Bandon, was audacious and shocking in its candour. It pointed out that formerly, when the funds of the Cork Foundling Hospital had been considerable, it had no problem in accepting deserted babies from different parts of the county of Cork. And in those days, all deserted babies from the area of Bandon were sent into Cork to the Foundling Hospital there. They were brought to a church warden of some parish in Cork, who then had his contact for getting such babies into the Foundling Hospital. But the funds did not stay plentiful in Cork, though the accounts would indicate that maybe they were. And so the Foundling Hospital in Cork ended up limiting itself to accepting babies from within the liberties of Cork. It could no longer accept babies from the county. And in these circumstances, the parochial authorities of Bandon devised a system for dealing with local deserted babies, and so saved themselves from the burden of support. As soon as he or she was discovered, the baby was handed over to Rebecca Clarke, who took the baby to Cork, and who could then, by a subterfuge, and she wasn't too detailed about that, get the baby into the Cork Foundling Hospital. It was left to Rebecca to explain how she got the babies into the Foundling Hospital. She explained that not only how she did it, but confirmed she was still doing it. Her method was to bring the baby into Cork, abandon it again in Cork, either at the gate of the Foundling Hospital or at the gate of some gentleman's residence. The baby thus became a deserted baby within the limits of the liberties of Cork, with an obligation on the Cork Foundling Hospital to accept it. In this way, a payment of 10 shillings to Rebecca Clarke saved the good burghers of Bandon from incurring an annual charge of up to £5 in maintenance costs for each deserted baby from the parish. In the alternative, it also saved them the charge of £5, which would have been payable to the Foundling Hospital in the first place. As will be seen, this charge was the subject of some debate in Bandon prior to the Poor inquiry. Rebecca Clarke further confirmed that she had provided this service within the previous 2 weeks and had been doing it for years. It was also separately recorded that she provided the same service to 3 other widespread parishes, and indeed where the Poor inquiry sat, and indeed it's probable that she provided it to various other parishes where no inquiry was held. But their complicity in this scheme had always left the foundling overseers in Bandon exposed themselves. They had only Mrs. Clarke's word that babies had been safely dealt with and were in fact in the foundling hospital. Proverbially, they knew nothing beyond paying for a service which appeared effective, and they took for granted that the babies just dealt with survived this double exposure. However, the commissioners appear to have judged her truthful because of her candour and demeanour. At one stage of the proceedings, one of the good citizens in Bandon sought to affirm his own integrity in this unravelling affair. Mr. Fawcett explained that he could not in all conscience have babies removed from the parish without having any further security for their safety other than the word of an individual. He further explained that the first two foundlings who were taken up in his year as churchwarden in Ballymoon were put out to nurse locally. Thus were the orthodoxies observed. However, he went on to say that his conduct in so doing was very much disapproved of because of the additional expense he brought on the parish. So much so that he gave the next baby to Mrs. Clarke to apply her system, and he salved his conscience by insisting that she promised to bring him a certificate of safe admission to the foundling hospital from a friend of hers who worked there. And of course, Rebecca Clarke could only respond that it was clearly impossible in the circumstances for her to obtain any such certificate. Mr. Fawcett then declared that he would put every other foundling out to nurse. And this impasse was dealt with at the time politically, I suppose, by having Mr. Falvey, who was Mr. Fawcett's colleague, take up all other deserted babies for that year and send them to Cork by Mrs. Clarke's system. In other words, Mr. Falvey had less of a conscience than Mr. Fawcett. Mr. Fawcett was thus the only dissenting voice at this sitting of the Poor Inquiry, and his dissent, I think, merely confirms the veracity of the rest of the evidence. The witnesses all readily admitted the wrong they were doing, but they excused and justified themselves by pointing out that if all the deserted babies were looked after locally, there would have been 3 times as many deserted, and the parish would have incurred a very heavy expense. Predictably, they readily confirmed that whatever the consequence, they would not allow a second desertion of a baby to happen again. And if you think about it, that's quite an ambiguous undertaking. After this startling admission, it sounded almost mundane and ordinary to hear that in the period from Easter to October of 1834, 3 deserted babies were sent from Ballymoon to Cork Foundling Hospital. In the previous year, 1833, 6 were sent to Cork, and the 2 mentioned by Mr. Fawcett were kept in the parish. 2 further deserted babies died in 1833 after being discovered, but before they could be sent to Cork. 3 such babies were sent to Cork in 1834 from the Kilbrogan parish, and if you look at a map of Bandon, Kilbrogan parish is that half of the town north of the river, Ballymoon parish was that half of the town south of the river. The 2 babies put to nurse in Ballymoon parish in 1833 were costing £3 each per annum, and the overseer checked them every 3 months. From this information, it appears that Rebecca Clarke was paid up to £6 in the period reported on, in respect of services provided in the town of Bandon alone. However, Rebecca Clarke was not yet finished with her audience. She had more stories to tell. Stories which were even more surprising and unorthodox than the evidence already given. She told that under the current system of management at Cork Foundling Hospital, it was comparatively easy for people to know with whom a child was put to nurse. She told of people gathering at the hospital gate to talk with the nurses, giving them presents and otherwise trying to persuade them to take good care of specific babies. Whiskey, eggs, tea, coffee and sugar were mentioned by Rebecca Clarke as being gifted in these circumstances. She also told of efforts by women to follow up their babies, and she related that a certain woman approached her to find out to whom a baby had been given to nurse. The woman was told that the baby had been given to Mrs. Crawley, a parish nurse, and then the woman approached Mrs. Crawley, who directed her to a Mrs. Murphy, to whom the baby had been sent. Rebecca could tell that this woman went and observed the baby with Mrs. Murphy, and afterwards expressed her gratitude for the information with gifts given to Rebecca. So some deserted mothers took care to see that their babies were safe and well looked after, indicating perhaps some regret over the desertion and the circumstances leading to it. Then Rebecca gave further and more surprising evidence. She first made the comment, in the context of women finding out to whom their babies were given to nurse, that it was not impossible for a mother to have herself chosen as the nurse of her own child, which had been admitted to the foundling hospital because of desertion. And at this stage, Rebecca Clarke told the story of an occasion when she was taking a child from Bandon to Cork, and it's quite a distance. I mean, I've driven it in the last month a couple of times. And if you look at her beat, it's quite a long stretch of road. I don't know from the poor inquiry whether she walked or whether she travelled on horseback or whether she had somebody with a horse and cart or something. But it's quite a beat. Anyhow, she made this comment that it was not impossible for a mother to be chosen to nurse her own baby. And she told of an occasion when she was taking a child from Bandon to Cork. And during the trip, she was stopped by a man and a woman on the bridge at Inishannon. Just here, just a little bit the Cork side of Bandon. The man specifically asked if she was taking the baby to the foundling hospital in Cork, and she answered that she was. He and his wife admired the child, and he explained that he and his wife were going to the foundling hospital to look for a baby, as his wife had just been delivered of a dead baby, and they wanted the baby for her to nurse. They expressed the wish to get that particular baby, as it was a particularly fine one. It was a baby girl, and Rebecca pointed out some distinguishing marks of the baby to help in its subsequent identification. And Rebecca confirmed to the commissioners that those two people applied at the foundling hospital the next day, and that they got that baby, and that they have been rearing it since. And Rebecca went on to express the opinion that perhaps the baby was theirs in the first place. And what Rebecca was describing here was a system where parents could risk deserting their own babies and then take them to nurse from the foundling hospital for the annual fee payable in such circumstances. There was a risk involved, but in a very poor country and with a substantial population living in extreme poverty, some parents might have resorted to this scheme to achieve being paid to bring up their own children. Rebecca Clarke believed so, and she was not in a position to judge the behaviour of others in a desperate, poverty-stricken society. I mentioned earlier about babies being placed with families and that perhaps the annual payment being discontinued. Right through the poor inquiry, the comment is made about how well babies settled in many cases to their foster families. And I just posed the question to you, in how many of those cases was something like this in the background, that the reason those children settled in so well is because that was their natural parents in the first place. You know, I no other evidence other than Rebecca Clarke, but I just posed the question. Rebecca Clarke provided her services to the parish of Kilbrogan and Ballymoon in Bandon. It was at the inquiry in these parishes that she told her story. The others attending this inquiry did not contradict her story, and so it was recorded and has survived. The inquiry also sat in the parish of Inishannon, which is just the Cork side of Bandon, but it's in a different barony, so there was a separate inquiry in Inishannon. At this parish, the short summary of evidence recorded that Mrs. Clarke provided the same service to this parish as she provided at Bandon. At Inishannon, it was recorded that Rebecca's services were availed of only once in the current year of 1834, and that there was no foundling or deserted baby in that parish in 1833. Two other parishes in County Cork, Kilgareth, which includes the town of Clonakilty, we're now a long way out from Cork, and Rosscarbery, right down here in the barony of East Carbery, also reported that they dealt with their deserted babies by what they actually called the Bandon method, with Rebecca Clarke specifically named at Rosscarbery. These parishes and their 4 baronies are spread across the area from the west of Cork to Skibbereen, and we have no way of knowing from the poor inquiry whether Mrs. Clarke provided a similar service to other parishes in this large area, but it is quite likely. Those giving evidence at Kilgareth, that's Clonakilty, were careful to say that formerly babies had been taken to Cork by the same method as to Bandon. They used the word formerly. They further added that Dr. Folliot, when he had occasion to do this, had always required a receipt to show how the babies had been disposed of. All these respectable people, all trying to get the paperwork in place. At Rosscarbery, there was no reticence about describing this practice as something that had happened in the past tense. And Mr. Thomas Morris, the parish churchwarden, stated that he had sent 3 babies to Cork by the woman Rebecca Clarke, and that he paid her a sum of £1 for each child. Now, and if you just think about it, so we know now Rebecca was charging 10 shillings to take a baby from Bandon into Cork. She was charging £1 to take a baby from Rosscarbery into Cork. So she had her scale of charges depending on the distance. He described her, this is Dr. Folliot now, he described her as giving him to understand that she procured in some clandestine way the admission of the babies to the hospital, and he admitted that he did not think it necessary to inquire as to the mode she adopted for achieving this. So again, we pay you, we don't want to know. It is entirely possible that Rebecca was providing the same service to other parishes in these 4 baronies, and in fact to other baronies in West Cork. All of the parishes mentioned were and still are along the main road from Cork to Skibbereen. Now it's now the N71. Lovely drive, but I now have different thoughts when I'm driving. And this appears to have been Rebecca's beat. Now, you know, again, I have no indication of how she travelled, but I suspect it wasn't on foot when she was covering distances like that. Because also, you think about the practicality. Like, even Bandon is a good day's walk from Cork if you were to walk the whole way. And with a newborn baby, and Rebecca not in a position to nurse it, the baby's not going to survive for a day. And she must have had some way of getting to Cork reasonably quickly. It appears from the information given that Rebecca earned substantial monies from this activity, and that she varied her charges depending on the distance from Cork City. There was a widespread demand for her services, indicating an unscrupulous attitude to keeping the local cess as low as possible. With some of that and some of what should have been the local burden passed over to Cork City. Thus, a substantial area of southwest Cork was using services provided by Rebecca Clarke and yielding a substantial income to her in the process. Apart from the widespread corruption indicated in these reports, the practice in West Cork gave rise to a situation, if you think about it, where any reported figures for abandoned babies in Cork City were substantially exaggerated by this transference of the problem from neighbouring and more distant parishes. So that's how the people of Cork got abandoned. The existence of Rebecca Clarke's system for disposing of abandoned babies in West Cork indicated a cynical practicality in dealing with local social problems. But through the long lens of history, we can overlook the place of contemporary social mores and attitudes in shaping these local policies and actions. In their attitude to the poor, the people of early 19th century made many important distinctions. Dr. Richard Whately, whom I mentioned earlier, one of the liberals of his generation and a major architect of the poor inquiry, he spoke of the distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. And that distinction informed all attitudes right through society. This distinction can be read into the framing of the headings under which evidence was taken in the poor inquiry itself. As we have seen, there was sincere debate among many of rank as to whether a foundling service actually increased the demand for it. The observation which weighed heavily in this discussion was that infanticide widespread. Because in other research I did, if you go through the outrage papers for the Tala area, there were huge numbers of deserted babies regularly found along the main Cork Road. It was a feature of life in this part of the country as well. The appointment of the parish unit of government as the unit of governance with responsibility for poverty only dated from the Act of 1703 in Ireland. At first, the children under 5 years were the responsibility of the parish, but after 1730, these children became the responsibility of the foundling hospital also. In Cork, the funding of the foundling hospital was provided for in the Act, and so this burden was more widely spread over all of those who could and did use coal. As after the hospital became unavailable to the parishes of County Cork, they were faced with a funding difficulty. And it seems that many of them had a real political difficulty in raising the local necessary cess. And we can see from the debate as between Mr. Fawcett and Mr. Falvey exactly where that debate was going. This is certainly clear from the evidence given at the poor inquiry at Bandon. The attitude of the Bandon burghers is corroborated by a similarity of attitude and of the method used to deal with abandoned babies in other parishes along this West Cork road. These people were happy to avail of a service which relieved them of the outcome of local indiscretions and of the necessity of raising a local cess to fund that problem. There was no great indication of remorse among these giving evidence, and their hard practicality was a reasonable reflection of the society, which drew hard distinctions between the deserving and the undeserving poor, and built workhouses where the poor might work to earn their sustenance. Now, I just want to finish up. Those were the people who turned up in Bandon to give their evidence. And you can see we have a couple of weavers there. We have a farmer holding 57 acres. We have Robert Clarke. We have Rebecca Clarke, who gave her, as you can see, her occupation, employed to take foundlings to Cork. The tobacconist, Michael Falvey, the churchwarden, John Fawcett, the churchwarden, Thomas Howard, a weaver, Hornybrook farmer, the Presbyterian minister, the two vicars, the Ballymoon and the Kilbrogan vicars, and the Reverend Daniel McSweeney, who is the Roman Catholic rector. So you can see there's a mixture, Cornelius Quinn. There's a mixture of occupations and there's a mixture of religions. Just as a matter of interest, I don't know if there's a local connection, but Duncan Stewart's mother, Mrs. Stewart, up at the top of Glenasmole, she was a Fawcett from Bandon. So we may be talking about one of her ancestors there, but anyhow. So that's it. Thank you. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
You mentioned the word pipes where,
Pipes.
where the
James is now built.
James, which was, I think it was called the Union.
It was
How did we get the
self-governed.
name of the pipes? Any idea?
The name of the pipes was there before it was acquired to build the workhouse on it. It then subsequently became the South Dublin. That's a pre-1735 name.
Yeah, because I held the name the pipes over the years. I remember walking from Dobbin's Farm.
Really?
Everybody walked down the back and it was called the pipes.
Yeah, I think it might
It
have
was a
been
great
to do-
curtain area, you know.
Right, okay.
It could have been to do with the diversion of the puddle which fed water into the basin in James's Street.
Right,
because that was diverted via pipe. That's
Right.
possible. possible explanation.
Yeah, okay, okay. Yeah. Yes?
Were there many children who were born illegitimately who were kind of worked into families? Do you know what I mean? Or this youngest sister, or that the father might eventually maybe not have been in a position to marry her, but have sustained the mother? Or were the mothers always abandoned?
No, they weren't. There's a great mixture and a great richness of life in how the problem was dealt with right across the country, and it was dealt in all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
The problems in those days were there was a problem of shame, there was a problem but the big problem was affordability. How a child was going to be financed and raised, because there was no work for anybody. And in one Church of Ireland vicar I came across in a sitting of the Poor Law Guardians, I forget where it is now, actually praised the Catholic clergy for their effectiveness in persuading the parents in these cases to actually marry and form a family. So there were all sorts of ways in which it was dealt with. But whereas there's a variety of ways, a huge proportion of them were put into foundling hospitals or abandoned in some way or other. And the other thing I was surprised about in going through it is that some parishes recorded that up to 5% of births were illegitimate. So this isn't a new problem at all. Up to 5% of births were illegitimate. So there are some things about human nature that never change. Yeah.
Any indication of how Rebecca died? Did she die in her own bed?
No indication whatsoever. No indication. This was our 15 minutes of glory. This
Did
particular.
she leave a will?
I don't know. And the funny thing about it is, I came across a couple of Rebecca Clarkes in the returns in Bandon at the time. Yeah. So whether she was a wife or whether she was a daughter or whether she was a mother, I don't know.
You write down.
No, but she had to, and it's quite obvious, the work she was doing as well. She had to have a mode of transport. She was making good money.
Yes.
She had a coach, I
She could
bet.
afford a taxi.
So there must be some paperwork somewhere showing bills of sales or something like that. Would be very intriguing.
It would, wouldn't it?
That
Yeah, and I came to that conclusion too.
Yeah.
This woman wasn't walking.
No.
She wasn't even looking at the length of the roads. And the time being critical.
And the roads are in good any.
Yeah.
A sort of side question, the issue of vagrancy. Is this the time of the Spalpeen? The guy who went from farm to farm with his spade over his shoulder, looking for work in local farmers?
There's no specific time for the Spalpeen, but certainly he would have been common at this time.
Yeah.
But I mean, I remember the Spalpeens into the early 20th century.
I don't know that far back.
No, but I do remember. I remember a couple of families of cabin men who used to regularly appear down here with their spades over the shoulder, looking to dig out the potatoes, and that was in the mid-50s.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Spalpeen, yes.
Sorry, is there any indications from the records what led Rebecca Clarke into her employment to take families? Was she asked originally, or did she have a particular career practice? Or was there any age given her?
There's no indication, and it's not clear from the record either when the Cork Foundling Hospital stopped taking babies from the County of Cork. But the Dublin Foundling Hospital closed in 1832. Maybe the Cork Foundling Hospital decided to limit its activities at that stage. But sometime, I suspect, about 1830, Rebecca, she was probably an opportunist. And this started to happen. The parish realised they were going to get stuck with this cost. How are they going to avoid it? And it sprung out of some discussions in the parish. But I don't have a specific date on that. Yes, Thomas?
Do we know, was Rebecca a Protestant or Catholic?
I'll tell you, I don't. And if you look here, whether there's a clue here, Robert Clarke Farmer spelt without the E.
Yeah.
Rebecca Clarke spelt with the N. And I don't know if there's a significance in that. There may well be. Because looking at the census for the census, I forget which one it is I found, but anyhow, there are Clarks with an E and Clarks without an E at that time in Bandon. That's the only indication I have. Yeah.
Just one other question.
Yeah.
In your testimony, normally, you know, you would be said you'd have to describe yourself and your age and marital status and stuff
No.
like that. Did you not have to do that?
No, she didn't. You didn't have to do
That's
that at
stage,
this.
all right.
The barest of information, you got their names, their title, obviously, always. With many of them, you got their occupations, and with a small percentage of them, you might get an address. If it was the manor or the big house, they would just mention the name of the house. But that was it. But I mean, it's very mixed. I mean, I came across several people around the country now, and I've listed about 1,800 names who gave evidence at the Poor Inquiry, and you have people giving their occupation as mendicant. I came across one interesting character who gave his occupation as mendicant and head schoolmaster.
John,
Yes.
was it legal what she was doing?
What do you think?
Well, there's an awful lot of honest, postly honest people on that list.
Absolutely.
And, you know,
And they were all complicit in it.
if she wasn't legal,
They were all complicit in it, because you take this guy, and where's this other guy down here? Yeah, these guys would have had to pay cess. And if they were going to have all this expense, their cess was going to go up. And here was a way that gets rid of this cost. You know, they were going to ask whether it was legal or not. They just didn't want the expense.
So the blind eye was really down.
So a blind eye. I just got the same with Dr. Foley down in Ross Harbour. He asked for a receipt, and once he got the receipt, he didn't care. You know, his conscience was clear. Yeah.
What made her go up and actually tell what was going on? Did she fall out with somebody or?
I don't know,
Yeah.
but it's a good question.
It is interesting.
And it's interesting, that they told the story
Yes.
at the other sittings as well.
Mm.
You know, I don't know whether all of a sudden there was a great splurge of conscience with these commissioners coming down to hear what they had to say. Because this would have been one of the first great inquiries that involved ordinary people. You know, you had various other inquiries where experts came over and they did an inquiry on canal traffic or fisheries or where piers might be needed around the coast or whatever it was going, or the roads. There were several inquiries on the roads, but this was the first inquiry that sat ordinary people down to hear their story. Now, it's a fabulously rich story because there's a whole other section in it that deals with petty sessions courts and story after story about fellas being had up for maintenance for the children they'd fathered. And it's all there. It's all there. But it just that ordinary people coming in front of these commissioners, getting this opportunity to speak, God only knows what compelled them to blurt it all out.
And Sean?
Yes.
I gather from people I've known from West Cork that Bandon had a particular reputation of being a very strongly Protestant town.
Oh yes.
I mean, there's a very old saying about it, which I won't repeat for fear
No,
of
that's all
offending
right.
people.
That's all right.
But it'd be where Bandon, where the pigs are Protestant.
Yeah, yeah.
But as I say, I don't wish to offend anybody, but that was a very common saying. Go back maybe 40 years ago.
Well, I tell you, I'll give you a modern version of that. Graham Norton. Graham Norton in an interview spoke about growing up as a Protestant in Bandon and the difference he felt from the other people around him. And his punchline is, and then I went to San Francisco and I discovered it's not because I was Protestant that I felt different. So, yeah, you know, but But then the other parishes of West Cork, I don't know what their religious mix was either. I must have a look at who attended. You get some idea from the list of attendance. But I think it's a fascinating story. Yeah, just happens to be topical right at the moment. You know? Yeah. Yeah.
Where did they come from?
A lot of them came from the South Dublin area.
Oh, did it? No, somebody was saying there was an orphanage up there.
No, and there was, don't think there was an orphanage in Arena. And there was, back in the 1830s, there was one orphanage in Dublin called, I think, the Virgo Maria, which reported that it fostered its children to farmers of Arena.
Yeah, because I know somebody.
Which we all do.
Yeah. But the families were good.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. No, and it's you know, it's a problem that has always been with us. It's different now because people can rear their children on their own, and the whole business about illegitimacy is gone. But and in fact, the funny thing is that I'm reading a book at the moment. It's a book called Liberty's Dawn by Emma Griffith, and she's a professor of history in England, and she's writing about the late 18th and early 19th century in England. And one of the things that struck me as one of the reasons I'm reading as a background to this is that she describes, and she has various sources that she's used, and she's describing a situation in England in the late 18th century and very early 19th century, from 1800 down to 1830, 1835, where single mothers, because of factories and because of being able to get factory jobs, reared their children themselves. And you had at that stage
The Industrial Revolution had
a huge impact, a huge impact.
Is there any parallel research of what was happening in Australia, Europe, and Germany, and France?
No, and I'll tell you, Emma Griffith's book, what she did was, there were about 350 short biographies of people in manuscript form, collected in various libraries all around England. And she went and read every one of them. Now, I think about a half a dozen of them, in fact, at the time, were of sufficient literary quality to be published. But all the rest were still, some of them only, there was one of them in particular she's described as only about 6,000–7,000 words long, and maybe a lot of them were just that size, where people took a diary or whatever, and those diaries survived. And she went and gathered them all and read through them. And these stories come out of that. And it's incredible the number of people who were single mothers, who reared their children and had the financial independence to do it 200 years ago. And we think it's a new thing.
Was that in England or Ireland?
That's in England. That's in England, yeah. And the funny thing is, she draws the distinction then, and it's just curious, you know, she draws the distinction between the areas of England that were industrialising and the areas that were still rural. And in the rural areas, the life she described then was very similar to what we had here. And there was huge regional variation in England, in standards, in financial independence, in the pace of industrialisation. Huge, and that surprised me as well.
In both the English and Irish context, I mean, there would have been wars every 40-odd years,
Yeah.
where Irish and English went to all the services, and lots of fathers never returned.
That's right. And one of the questions we'll be looking at in the future lecture is that one of the things I've come across is how little difference there was in Ireland at those times between single mothers and young widowed women with young children. And one of the points that comes at you again and again and again, and this might surprise you, is that single mothers generally made a better stand at surviving than young widows, because they had less shame about begging. And that's commented on time and time again. It's an incredible story in itself.
This is Margaret Alward, the foundress of the St. Bridget's. She didn't really have orphanages, but she placed the children out into farming communities, in particular in Tala and Clondalk and so on. And the people that took on the job of looking after fostering the children were called rarers.
Yeah. Oh, there were plenty of families in this area who were rarers. Absolutely. Yeah. Any other questions? Tomas is going to wrap up on us there.
No, you're fine. You have another few minutes. People want to ask questions. Thanks very much, Sean. I'd like to thank Sean very sincerely for giving this talk, a really eye-opening talk to the society here, first of all, and I hope talks of this kind are published in the near future. It's a lot of work and very, very worthwhile.
Thank you, sir.
Really eye-opening. And I might mention there, just when you were mentioning about the women who are independent enough, who are employed in industrial areas, when I bring people on visits to St. Mary's, the Reverend Deverill often points out a banner in the corner of the church with MU on it, and he makes a point of telling people about the Mothers' Union, which was set up in cities where you had industry and where mothers were employed in the industry for to help them rear their children, particularly if they hadn't got their own parents nearby for to assist them.